everybody. Welcome to another video from the training department. I'm Adam, your training director, and this video is all about teaching tips for Ielts. We'll explore tips for each skill. So if you're interested in a particular skill, you could skip to that section and watch that section, or if you're just re-watching to remember some tips, you can go to the section you're interested. If this is your first time watching this, please make sure that you've already watched the general Ielts video so you know about each part. And then if you're ready, let's start. Okay, now we're going to look at the speaking test, and I'm going to give you some tips that you can use in your classes to help teach this. So the first thing to be aware of is our students really lack world knowledge and they lack experience. So one problem that they can encounter in the speaking test is they don't have an opinion, or they just don't know. Well, the tip here is it's okay, it's not a test of knowledge. What it's a test of is a test of English. If they can talk about it using the English, for example, they can say, I'm not really sure, but I guess, or I've never thought about that, but I think, or for example, if it's about a museum and they've never been before, I've never been, but I think it would be. That way they can show that they still have a strong command of English, even if they don't know. A game that I used to do in class is called quick thinking. In quick thinking, I give my students a topic. My students must make up a story about that topic. It does not matter if it's correct, if it's a true story, or if it's a fake story. Then, during the class, I'll shout, "Stop!" I will write a new topic on the board, and then students must think of a new story about that topic. Again, I stress, it does not have to be true. This just gets students in the habit of thinking quickly and being able to provide a story with their ideas, and this can help them in the test. Another thing that our students struggle with is talking in detail, especially in parts 2 and part 3 of the speaking test. I have 2 strategies for you. The first strategy is use your senses. So think about, what can you see? What can you smell? What can you hear? What can you touch? What can you taste? So if we take the example of speak about your favorite teacher. Okay, was there anything special about the way they looked? Was there anything special about the way that they sounded? Anything special about the way that they smelt? Is there anything special about the clothes they wore, or how it felt? Or anything special about their hands, or the way that they looked? This can be a strategy that can really help students to have a method of attacking the question. Okay, my second strategy is to talk about the past, the present, and the future. So again, if we talk about the favorite teacher example, talk about the past, okay? In the past, who was your favorite teacher? What teachers do you remember from the past? What did they teach you that you still remember now? Talk about the present. How have you changed in the present because of those past teachers? Think about the future. In the future, what do you want to do that those teachers reminded you of? What do you want to pass on to future generations you got from those teachers? These are 2 strategies that students can use when approaching the speaking test, which can just help them to be able to speak in more detail and speak at length. And while we're speaking about length is, like I said, part 2 and part 3 have to be lengthy answers. So in our class, our students need to practice speaking at length. Our students need practice in speaking for 2 minutes. Because if they never actually get practice speaking for 2 minutes, they'll never be able to do it. So in your class, I really recommend that you give students timed speaking exercises where they can be speaking for 2 minutes. So if one student is speaking, what are the other students going to be doing? Well, then you need to have listening tasks. A few listening tasks you could set up is maybe student A is speaking, student B can be making notes and writing questions. This helps with both making note skills, which is important for the listening and reading. It also helps with skills of thinking of follow-up questions. This is important because it helps them to predict questions they may get in part 3. Another task you can give listeners is that listeners can have the task of evaluating the speaker. However, if you do this, I really recommend that you focus on one very specific area so that the listener is not trying to give the speaker too much feedback. For example, focus on pronunciation, focus on vocabulary use, focus on grammar use. Then really focus on giving feedback about this skill for the speaker. This way, the speaker will get practice speaking for a lengthy time. The listener will be made aware of the errors that the speaker is making, and the speaker will get feedback to help make their speaking better. Okay, this has been some basic tips for the speaking exam. Hope this will prove useful. Next, we'll go on to listening. Okay, this part will be about tips for teaching listening for IELTS. First of all, the most important tip is know the test. Anytime we do listening in IELTS classes, we have a purpose behind it. We have a purpose to help our students with a different part of the listening. If students are aware of the different parts and what they can expect in each part, this can really help them. And if any time you do listening in class, you tell students very specifically, this is practice for part 1, this is practice for part 2. When they come to do the test, they'll be so much more prepared. My second tip is be aware of distractors. What are distractors? Well, distractors are basically false information which can confuse students. If we take an example of, okay, you'll see this question on your screen here. How old is Lucy? Maybe A is 17, B is 18, C is 19. The answer might look something like this. Oh, hello there. What's your name? Hi, yes, my name's Lucy. Okay, and how old are you? It says here that you're 17. No, that's wrong. I made a mistake. Actually, I'm 18. 18. But you know you have to be 19 to join this course, right? Yeah, I know, but I'm applying for next year. Did you catch the answer? You probably did. Now, you see that there is information about each one of these answers, and in IELTS we call these distractors. This can be really confusing to students because if they hear information about each of the answers, they want to answer as soon as they hear the first piece of information. Something you can do to make students more aware of this is, in your class when they do listening, ask your students to make notes on each one of the answers. What information did you hear about A? What information did you hear about B? What information did you hear about C? Then you can discuss it in pairs and discuss it as a class to review where the false information was, where the correct information was. Another fantastic task to help students become more aware about this is let students write their own questions. When students write their own questions and they prepare their own example listening questions, they have to create distractors themselves. When being more aware of this can really help them when they come to the listening test because they're not going to fall into the trap. They're aware that there will be distractors. Another tip is, if you miss a question, move on. Remember, in the listening test, we only get to listen one time. Students need to know that if they miss information about one question, move on to the next question, then later come back and guess. Remember, you don't get marked down for incorrect answers, you just get a no answer is the same as an incorrect answer. So if students don't know, you need to encourage them to guess. How can we guess? Well, this is my next tip, is something you really need to work on in class is preparation and prediction tasks. Often in the IELTS listening, you can either predict what the answer is going to be or what type of word the answer is going to be. For example, you can often predict if the answer is going to be a number, if it's going to be a place, if it's going to be a verb, an adjective, a name. So even if students don't get the answer, you can try and predict and try and guess. Something I do in all of my IELTS classes is When we are listening, before we listen to anything, I make my students make one prediction for each answer, each question. This way, maybe they'll be wrong, maybe they'll be correct, but this way they're thinking before they listen. So when they do get to that question, their brain is already prepared and they know what information they're going to be listening for. This can really, really help students. As well as, before they listen, they can look at the keywords in the question, and the keywords in the questions can help them make better predictions, better guesses about what they're going to listen to. So, it sounds funny, but one of the biggest tips for teaching listening for IELTS, is make sure that you spend a lot of time before they listen. Spending lots of time before listening to prepare them is really important, because in the exam they only listen one time, so they must be super prepared. Okay, that's listening. I hope that's some useful tips. Next, let's move on to reading. Okay, in this part we'll be talking about some tips for teaching the reading part of the IELTS test. My first tip is reading can be fun. It doesn't always have to be long and boring. Yes, you do need to practice academic texts, but you can also try something more fun. You can find something more fun, like take something from your favorite website, take some interesting news, take something from a novel that you enjoy. You can use an authentic text. However, what is important is that you keep the questions as IELTS type questions. So use questions like yes, no, not given, matching headings to paragraphs, summarizing information, paraphrasing information. So for tip number one is use more interesting text every now and again to keep your lessons interesting, but keep the question types as IELTS type questions. Next tip is practice asking the question, where is the answer? How do you know? Get students to underline where they find each answer and to put the question number next to their answer. If you're asking students of what's the answer and they can't show you where they found the answer, do not accept it and ask students to go back to the text, find where the answer is. This can help avoid confusion on yes, no, not given questions, because sometimes they think it's not given and it's based on a feeling rather than the information in the actual text. Next tip is, as students are reading, get students to quickly summarize each of the paragraphs just using a few words. This can help them lock in their mind about the content of that paragraph. Then, when they come to answer the questions, they can easily find the answer in a very quick way. Next is about topic sentences. The topic sentences are the first or maybe first two sentences of each paragraph. This contains the general idea of that paragraph. One activity is you can give students a reading task, but only give them the topic sentences of each paragraph. Then give students the questions. Based on the topic sentences, can they guess where to find the answer to each question? The answer is probably yes. Hopefully this will show the students that when reading, one strategy for reading quickly is to only read the topic sentence of each paragraph and then read the questions, and then when they have a good idea of where to find their answer, go back to the text, read in more detail, help them find where their answer is more quickly. As you know, students don't have very much time with this. My final tip is, when you practice reading, every reading text you do, there will be many words that students don't know. Before you end a reading task, have students go to the text, have students pick out maybe 5 words that they don't know. Then have students try to guess the meaning of this word. They don't have to define it, but they can tell you what they think it means, what word is it similar to, based on how they read it in the context. This can help to build skills of predicting and guessing vocabulary and meaning from context, which is a really important skill to do because in the IELTS reading, they're not going to know all of the words. Okay, these have been a few tips for teaching reading in your class. If this moved a bit quickly, then feel free to watch it back, or when you have your next reading lesson, turn this video back on and give it another look. Okay, the final part will be writing. Hey, in this part, we're going to share with you some tips for teaching writing. Remember, writing has two parts. So let's talk about part one first. Remember, part one, we should encourage students to spend 15 to 20 minutes, absolutely no longer than 20 minutes on this part. Students should be writing 150 words or as close to this as possible. The more words that they write, the more room they have to make errors, make mistakes, and actually bring their mark down. So it's best they try to get as close to this number as possible. Here's a little trick that you can use to help count your word count. Count how many words you have on each line. Count how many lines you have written. Then do some maths. This can save you some time, and in the exam you don't want to be counting every single word. Next, in writing part one, there's a good chance that you'll be writing about a table or a graph. If you write about a table or a graph, then you can teach your students some very specific vocabulary. This is vocabulary for describing trends. This can be things like rising, falling, fluctuating, changing. There are many words out there where your students will be very likely to use these words in the actual test, so it's worth spending some time on them. Also, bear in mind that it's a good idea to teach your students some adverbs to describe how these trends are. For example, sharply increasing, dramatically increasing, gradually decreasing. These are words which your students will find very, very helpful for writing part one. My next point is that writing part one is all about facts. It's all about what you can see in the test question. So, don't be writing your opinion. Don't say that, okay, if the graph is about the internet and music, you cannot say that music popularity increased when it became more available because of the internet. Okay, maybe this point is absolutely correct, but unless the table or the graph shows that information, you should not be including it in your essay. Next is one skill that students really need is they need to be to identify key information in the table, the graph, or the diagram. Students can't necessarily do this automatically. So this is something which is a good use of class time. Help students to look at many tables, graphs, bar charts, diagrams. Be able to identify the important information in these tables and graphs quickly. The more time you spend on this in class, the easier it will become and the better your students will become at this. Another great activity to use in class when we're talking about graphs or tables is give students a description of a graph or a table. Then ask students to draw this graph or table or diagram. By working backwards and going from the words to the picture, students really have to understand what is in the essay, and it can help them see what a graph looks like, what a table looks like. By working backwards, it makes them more aware of tips and tricks they can use while they're writing part one. Okay, there's some tips for writing part one. Let's go to writing part two. Writing part two, as I said before, and as you learned in the general IELTS video, is worth double points. One more time, worth double points. This is why we must spend more time in it. We recommend that you spend 40 to 45 minutes on this question. In fact, one tip that I often share with students is, if you're worried you don't have enough time, do part two first. If you do part two first, you can make sure you're spending enough time where you're going to get more points. As we shared before, you should try to write 250 words. If you write less, you will lose points on the task achievement band criteria. Don't try to write too much more because same with part 1, you'll be making more mistakes. One thing that students really struggle with writing part 2 is the same as speaking. They lack opinions, they lack vocabulary, they lack ideas. What I like to do in class is I like to provide them with ideas and then have them discuss which idea they agree with most. This can help show them the type of ideas that they can suggest, and it makes it less personal for them, which actually makes it easier. For example, if we take pollution, what I will do in class is give them some ideas of how the government can help pollution, how the individual can help pollution, how the local community can help pollution, and have students discuss the positive points, the negative points of each argument, and this can make them more aware how they can build their own argument. In terms of vocabulary, when I start a new unit when I'm teaching my Ielts classes, I spend a lot of time on key vocabulary and key issues. I teach them in my classes because I always assume that my students don't have any idea and they have no ideas about these key issues or the key vocabulary. By teaching them as a part of my lesson, it's giving them more chance to give them a broader range of vocabulary and ideas, so no matter what question they get, they can provide an answer. Next, I normally advise my students that 2 sides are easier than 1. What does this mean? This means that often you'll get questions like, to what extent do you agree with? Talk about both sides and present your own opinion. 2 sides are easier than 1. Even if you agree 100%, often it can be easier to think of ideas for both sides and it can help you write a more balanced essay. So it's often a good idea to write 1 paragraph about agree, 1 paragraph about disagree, and in your conclusion, say which one you agree with more. This is just a technique to help students be able to write more and be able to write more convincingly, especially when they're under these very time pressures. Next, structure. I really suggest that when we're teaching writing part 2, we spend a lot of time in class about structure and teaching students how to structure their essays. For example, in the introduction, we can introduce our argument and briefly introduce both sides. Next paragraph can write about the for idea, next paragraph about the against idea, and the final paragraph we can weigh it up and give our own opinion. In class, what I like to do with writing part 2 is I don't let students sit and write for 40 minutes, but I like students to brainstorm the content of each paragraph. This can help them get into the habit of thinking about the content for each paragraph before they actually write. The writing a lot of the time comes into homework, but my class time is spent a lot on structure and organizing their paragraphs so that they know the ideas that they can put into it, because I find my students really struggle with this. Okay, and that is the end of our writing section. I hope that this video has been helpful to you to learn more about the Ielts test, learn more about each specific section, and learn some very practical tips that can help you teach your Ielts classes. Again, as I mentioned at the start of the video, feel free to watch this as many times as necessary, or when you come to teaching writing, re-watch the writing section to give you some more ideas. Okay, cool. Hope to see you in the next video.